Welcome to the Gay Buddhist Forum, where teachers from all schools of Buddhism offer their perspectives on the Dharma and its application in modern times, especially for LGBTQI audiences. These talks are offered freely to the world and made possible by appreciative listeners. If you would like to support our efforts to share the Dharma with underserved audiences, please visit gaybuddhist.org. There you can donate, find a list of upcoming speakers, or enjoy many hundreds of these recorded talks dating back to 1996.
This is a talk on gay sexuality and the Dharma, June 11th, 1995, at the Gay Buddhist Fellowship in San Francisco. It has been a difficult winter. We got flooded out on the Russian River in January, and that was just the beginning. So it's really a joy to be here in this room with you today. It really feels like coming home. I just last weekend led a retreat for lesbians, co-led a retreat for lesbians and gay men up at the Cloud Mountain Retreat Center in southern Washington State. And I was asking, what sort of activity there was for lesbians and gay men in the Dharma in the Portland area, nice big metropolitan area, and there's very little indeed. Just reminded again of how very valuable and precious this organization is, the fact that we have this here. And although we live so distant now that I don't get here very often, I really am always conscious of the fact that this organization is here and doing, I think, a really wonderful service to us gay men. Several gay men over the last few years have asked me to talk on the subject of gay sexuality and the Dharma. And I've danced around that request because it's a very controversial subject in our community, or can be. But so many people have said, how can I bring my sexuality into my spiritual life and spiritual practice? So I'd like to talk about that this morning. And I really want to say that that what I'll be sharing with you is, I think a few years ago I really decided for myself that I really needed to really explore this aspect of my own life as a way of really integrating it into my Dharma practice and Dharma life. And so what I'll be sharing with you this morning is just what I've learned from this inquiry. This is definitely an unfinished project, and what I've learned is not what I will learn. And what you may have learned in your own journey in this respect may be quite different from what I've learned. I really don't feel like I'm an authority on the subject. I just want to share kind of how the project's coming along. And we may differ. And again, this is a fairly controversial subject in our community. We may differ, but I think we can differ with respect in this context. I think the single most important thing for me on this subject of our sexuality and the Dharma comes from the fact that the teachings of Buddhism are not a moral system. The moral categories of right and wrong, of good and evil, of good and bad, do not exist in this worldview. And we have all grown up in a Western worldview which has those kinds of moral categories. And we've all been inculcated with those ideas from birth onward. And I just want to emphasize really clearly that the perspective of the Dharma is very different. That the Buddha said that his only concern was about suffering and the end of suffering. It's about happiness and suffering. There isn't, and he would talk about what is useful or skillful. He said what is skillful is what leads to happiness. What is unskillful is what leads to suffering. And it's simply a matter of cause and effect. He said that certain kinds of actions lead to happiness, certain kinds of actions lead to suffering. He said if you want to be happy, and if you want others to be happy, if you want to avoid suffering and to avoid suffering for others, then do these things and avoid doing these things. There isn't a judgment involved. it's really important, I think, to get that because our society, as we all know, has all kinds of judgments around sexuality. The way we have been taught to feel shame about our bodies, to feel shame about our actions, the ways in which we get the message that sexuality is dirty or wrong, and it's really very, as you know, it's a very schizoid kind of culture because we get those kinds of messages, and we also have all sorts of very graphic depictions of sex. And it feels to me that those are two sides of the same coin. And so if we want to find a way of really bringing wholeness to our Dharma lives, we have to recast the way we look at our sexuality. I think this is particularly important for us as homosexual people. Because this culture, although everyone in this culture learns shame about their bodies and shame about sexuality and feelings of guilt, that particularly has been laid on us. So that the language of one of the anti-gay referenda was that homosexuality is immoral, unnatural, perverse, and wrong. We get those kinds of messages from this culture all the time. And I think it's really important to be clear that this perspective, the perspective of shame and guilt, doesn't have a place in the worldview of the Dharma. And the Buddha's guidelines on sexuality were very simple. He said, simply use your sexual energies in ways that bring you happiness and not in ways that bring harm. And his guidelines, and I think that's all we need to know. And then we just pay attention. Pay attention to how we're being sexual in the world and seeing what effect it has. The Buddha talked about some specific situations. Obviously rape and using our sexuality in ways that impose force are unskillful. They lead to suffering. He said that having sex with people who are too young to make a clear judgment, or people who may be developmentally challenged and don't have the clarity of mind or the maturity to make a clear judgment, may be unskillful or is unskillful. And the third thing he said was that having sex in such a way that a third person would be hurt could be unskillful. And again, these are guidelines. They are not moral imperatives. All we're asked to do is to pay attention to how we use our speech and our actions, and whether our speech and actions lead to harming or whether they lead to happiness. So that feels so important to me, and I think we all know this intellectually, but on deeper levels of our consciousness, we all carry this shame and the guilt that we've learned from this culture, which tries, I think, in many ways to divide our sexuality from the rest of our lives. By taking on the worldview of the Dharma, I think there's much more of a way of bringing it to wholeness. A second point, I think that there's no way to avoid dealing with our sexuality. I think, as people say, they want to bring it into their lives and make it more whole. Repression just doesn't work. Freud. I should just say one other thing about this moral worldview. I think it's good for us to get out of the moral categories that the West has given us, but there's also a lot of play that we can have in there. That a lot of our humor comes from playing with those moral categories. And I just think about Mae West, who is one of the sexual icons of our age. She said, I used to be Snow White, but I drifted. So, maybe that wouldn't fit into the Buddhist worldview too much, and I hope we can keep that play of naughtiness that she was so wonderful at. But Freud spent his whole life exploring the ways in which repressed sexuality comes out in weirdness, basically. And so it doesn't really work to repress our sexuality. And it really doesn't work for us gay men. I know that for decades or centuries or millennia, we have been obliged to repress our sexuality because of the heterosexism of the cultures that we've lived in. Now that our sexuality is out of the closet, it's not going back in. And I think we need to be very clear about that. So repression doesn't work. We do need to deal with it. One of my teachers, Christopher Titmus, became a monk very early in his 20s in Thailand. And he got to know an old Thai monk who was in his mid-90s and had been a monk for 60, 70 years. And he said to him, you're now very old and you're very close to death and you've been a monk all these years and you've done all this practice. What are the issues that you really work with in your life at this point? And he said, sex. So there it is. There's a way in which some spiritual traditions can also encourage repressing our sexuality. One of the great Thai teachers of this century, Ajahn Chah, whom I respect a great deal, said to his monks at one point, you're better off putting your penis in a viper's mouth than to put it in a woman's vagina. And there's a lot of that kind of attitude, even in the spiritual tradition that I'm involved in, the Theravada Vipassana tradition. There's a way in which, with a sort of New Age spirituality, there's so much talk about spirit, of attaining spirit, and somehow losing contact with our earthly lives. The American poet Wallace Stevens said, the way through the world is more difficult than the way beyond it. But really, the way through the world is really our task, I think. So we deal with it in a variety of ways. And again, I don't think there's any moral judgment about any one of them. We may choose celibacy as a way of dealing with our sexuality, as long as we're willing to deal with it. I've been talking a lot with a gay Trappist monk in the Catholic tradition in South Carolina, who has been a monk for many years, and he said that he really actively chooses to be celibate in his life right now because he wants to devote himself to intensive meditation practice as a monk. And I questioned him about it, and he said, "No, this is really right for me in my life right now." And I said, "I really support you to do that. I made the same choice myself back in the 80s when I was doing a lot of intensive practice." So I think celibacy is a valid choice if it works for people. I think monogamy is a valid choice. That's the choice that I'm making in my life right now, and it works for me very well. I think that having multiple sexual partners is a valid choice for people as long as you really notice, whether there is harm happening. So they're all valid choices. The most extreme choice I've encountered, I ran into a few months ago when I was back in New England and went for a visit with someone I knew for many years, and he has been tormented. He's a straight man. Has been tormented by his sexual energy. He just hasn't known what to do with it, and so he chose to castrate himself. I was really shocked when I heard that, and my first concern was about his health, and he said, "No, it healed very well." And I said, "Well, has it worked?" And he said, "Well, I feel a lot calmer now." But then he said that he fell in love with a woman not long after that happened, and that their sexual life has been very much affected by his choice. So again, if it works for him, it's not a choice I would recommend for myself or for others. But I would like to talk a bit about the choices that I have made in my own life in terms of my sexuality through most of the 80s. I chose to do a lot, years of intensive meditation practice, and was really powerfully drawn to do that, and so I was in a celibate situation for years through the 80s, and really put my sexual life pretty much on hold. And I look back on it and I realized that was an absolutely valid choice for me at that time. And it sort of came to an end when I was in a year-and-a-half long retreat, and I was living during the warm months way out deep in the forest in Massachusetts, beautiful place, in a big tent. And I was completely alone. I was a hermit. I went in for food once a day, and then just spent the time in the forest. And it was, in many ways, the happiest time of my life. My mind became very clear and very calm. And I had a kind of erotic relationship to the world. It wasn't genital, but I would take off, sometimes on hot days, I'd take off all my clothes and walk through the woods for 1.5 miles to an old reservoir and take a long swim and walk back. And it was just wonderful. And the mind was really pretty clear and open and very connected to the world. And then I fell in love with a fellow retreatant who was straight, unfortunately, and fortunately, I should say. And there was no sexual contact, but I just fell in love with this person. And all of this sort of suppressed sexuality came roaring through, and suddenly this beautiful tent in the forest became a prison, And I was miserable. And I realized I have to now, it's now at that stage of my life where I have to make sexuality and relationship my practice, and to go after it in the same intensity that I took following my breath and doing other formal spiritual practices. And that was at the end of 1989. And the intervening years, although I've done a fair amount of intensive meditation practice in those years, these last 5 years, 6 years, have been about doing that, of learning. And I'd like to just share a few things that I've learned. One thing, and a couple of them are really delightful. One thing is that I've learned that doing meditation practice, and doing a lot of it, really improves your sex life. Because really what practice does is it makes you more present. Vipassana is about being aware of things as they happen. And if your mind's not distracted and wandering off and getting lost in thought and being chaotic, and you're here, you can feel sensations as they happen. You can feel energies passing back and forth with another person. Your mind doesn't wander, it's concentrated. And so the experience is much more intense. Another thing that I've learned that is has been a delightful surprise, and that is learning the distinction between desire and rapture. And they're quite similar in some ways. Desire, and let me give you an example. I'm sure that you have the same experience, that there's certain kinds of bodies that just turn me on. And if I see one of those bodies running down the street or something, my head turns. And I think that before I did a lot of meditation practice, a really powerful desire comes up, and it's a painful experience where you want something and you're not going to get it, and it's a contracting feeling in the mind and heart, and it's painful. And what I've found is that gradually over time, and more now, that rapture comes instead. And rapture is the kind of delighted feeling that you feel when you see a beautiful sunset or you see the Grand Canyon. And so very often now I see a beautiful body and the feeling is, oh wow, hooray, thank you God, and it's such a different feeling. It's sort of open-hearted and open-handed, and it's a delightful enjoyment of something beautiful as opposed to that kind of grasping feeling. And this is not that desire doesn't still come up for me, it does, but it's less and less, more and more rapture. Another distinction that has been very powerful for me, and really, really useful, is to be able to see in the Vipassana practice and the progress of insight that happens by doing Vipassana practice. There's one particular insight which is really important, and that is they call it the distinction of seeing the difference, or the distinction between nama and rupa, of consciousness and material existence. of really seeing in here the difference between mind and body. To see that they're completely interdependent and that one can't exist without the other, but they are distinct. And I know it seems kind of obvious intellectually, but when you really get it on a very deep intuitive level, all kinds of things start to happen from that insight, from that understanding. A similar kind of insight came to me around sexuality for myself, and that was coming to understand that I had been confusing two things. One was physical pleasure, and the other was emotional satisfaction or emotional gratification. And that very often I had been going for one when I really was going for the other and didn't know it. And to be able to see that distinction between what the body wants, and it's such a powerful force, you know, our sexual energies are really primal and very powerful. What the body wants, you know, and what the heart wants, and really to see the difference. And I realized that really what I wanted even more than to get my rocks off was to have a very close emotional connection to another person. That I was really seeking intimacy, seeking that kind of satisfaction. It was so valuable for me to see that. To see that certain kind of compulsion for sex, for the physical gratification, was masking the desire for intimacy. And this is really important. Studies have shown that gay men are having unprotected sex now, partly out of low self-esteem, but also partly for a desire for intimacy. And we've seen that I work for an organization that's trying to stop the sexual abuse of children. And many studies have shown that people misuse children sexually out of a desire for intimacy, to get away from their sense of separateness and aloneness. Seeing that distinction has been altogether important for me, so that I've tried to find a way in which, as it were, the genitals and heart can work together. You know, that they really work together, and I find that has been so much more satisfying for me, to find a way in which, for me, and again, this is only my own choice, and I don't say it's the right one necessarily, but for me, having a very close emotional bond really intensifies the sexual pleasure. And the image that I have of the relationship that I'm in now, monogamous relationship, when I think of, well, what's the most wonderful thing about it, is that we have this little personal ritual of reading before we go to sleep every night. And, we get into bed without clothes, and I curl up on my partner's chest while he reads. And that emotional bond, and we just started the 4th volume of the Narnia series of C.S. Lewis. It just, there's a lot of sex in our relationship, but that, if I have one image, that's the one that seems most valuable or very valuable to me. And then finally, just one other point. I think that in order to really look and deal with our sexuality, I think we also need to look at the whole issue of our aloneness, our loneliness, and that pain of separation that we all feel. And I think that there's such valuable investigation there. I mean, we could go on for a long time about this one point. But one of the things that I've discovered by investigating in terms of my own life, I've discovered that what the function that orgasm really has for me is, yes, there's a tremendous amount of physical pleasure, but actually the function that it has for me is that it explodes temporarily any sense of a separate self. And that's what we are craving in our spiritual lives. I think that to a large extent is what we're craving in our sexual lives as well, whether we're conscious of it or not. That we carry around that our root pain, the deepest pain we carry, is the sense of separateness and aloneness that comes from the ego delusion. the delusion that we are separate selves. And consciously or unconsciously, we are drawn to getting past that sense of separateness and finding a feeling of union and wholeness. And that's what happens in our spiritual practice. That's what enlightenment is. It's just the blasting away of that sense of a separate self. And I think there's almost like a little moment of enlightenment that happens in orgasm too. It just blows it away for a while. And then we come back, and I think a lot of the sadness that comes after orgasm may be the fact that we're coming back into the prison of ourselves. After having that experience where the sense of self is either attenuated or disappears. So I think that maybe perhaps some of the way in which we can be compulsive sexually or be addictive sexually is to get that sense, to have over and over again that sense of no self. And I think if we see that, there's a way in which somehow our sexuality and our spiritual practice can really work together, because ultimately it's all about non-separation, about ending the separation, a sense of separate self we have. Well, I'd like to leave time for discussion. I think this is such a rich subject. We could have many sessions on this subject. But if you have any questions or comments, please.
Have you tried body electric, described as tantric massage, which is another way of exploding the ego and getting out of it, in a sense?
Mm-hmm. I haven't, but I've heard of that.
As an older man, my experience is that as I lose the desire to ejaculate, I really don't need to, and I find I've had many more orgasms not ejaculating, and I've also found that doing body electric style massage is really just been a wonderful way to solve some of our predicaments, such as loneliness.
Mm-hmm.
They do some wonderful groups, and also it is a way to get out of your ego for an extended period of time in some ways.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think it may be age appropriate. Someone told me that at 18, I'd rather get it off. But.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Yeah, I think it wasn't the Body Electric School was started by a gay man. Is that right?
That's right. John Kramer.
Yeah.
Jesuit. Another great contribution of the Catholic.
Thanks. Please.
Eric, I don't know if you want to answer this. It's kind of a personal question, but do you think that the change that you experienced when you see someone who attracts you, and the change from desire, not having it, to rapture, was part of that a result of actually being in a relationship that was satisfying for you? So it wasn't something that reminded you that you didn't have that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. No, I think that's a wonderful question, and I think that's in part what has happened, because I have a very satisfying emotional and sexual relationship. Then it's easier for me to feel rapture when I see that beautiful body running by. But it also happened while I was alone. It was just, I think that it's just an inevitable and natural consequence of the practice is that desire very slowly over time diminishes, and rapture, which is one of the factors of enlightenment that's needed for enlightenment, gets stronger. So, yeah, I mean, there are certainly times when I was feeling desperately lonely when I was alone, and I would see a beautiful body, and there was a waiter in Massachusetts where I went to breakfast often, and I found him so beautiful when he would come up to take my order that I couldn't speak. I don't know if you've had those experiences. And I have to say it was part rapture, but a lot of it was desire as well. So, good question. Thanks.
In your own experience, how can you control that desire?
I think that...
to totally control.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. No, it's really... Did everyone hear that question? It's how do you control that desire, which can completely control you? I think it's a very, very important question. I think the most important thing we can do to work with, not to control the desire, but to dance with the desire, is not to turn away from it. To really say, okay, this is desire. And although it's very painful, there's a wonderful image of Milarepa, the great Tibetan yogi, who found demons in his cave when he went back to his cave where he'd been practicing, and he used various means to get rid of all but the fiercest, and that one was left, and there was nothing else that he could do. So he beckoned to the demon to come closer to the fire so that he could see him better, and then he put his head in the demon's mouth, and the demon disappeared. And it's like it's really opening completely to this very painful experience of desire and saying, okay, desire, here you are, you're part of my life, I want to know you as well as I can, come closer. Because what we tend to do is do this, do anything to get rid of the desire. If you really invite desire over and over again, even though it's very painful, and you put your head in its mouth and you say, okay, here you are, and here we are together, sooner or later it begins to lose its force because you're not resisting it so much anymore. You're not trying to get rid of it. You're just really opening to it. And it can still be painful, but it's like an old painful friend. Oh, there you are again. It's different. It really changes. And I don't say that glibly because it's a hard practice. But I find I work more with anger than with desire, but it's the same kind of thing, or strong fear. Just open to it and get to know it, without resisting it. And it really begins to lose some of its force.
Otherwise, you say, go ahead and experience that.
Yeah, experience it. And not only experience it, but get to know it, investigate it. Who are you? Where did you come from? What causes this desire? Just know it as completely as you can.
That's part of that. I think it's the most difficult part of practice for me has always been entering completely into every situation, whatever it is. Because you always want to hold back, want to protect something. And I think entering into desire is just like entering into any other emotion or feeling or realization that occurs. And entering it fully means you can't hide from anything. You can't go into a rock somewhere. Everything has to be exposed, I think. And that's the hardest part of practice, because there's areas that, we'd say it over and over again, like people will say, oh, I can do this part of the practice, but over here, this thing I don't want to touch. But that's exactly what we have to touch. The stuff that's like, to me, the issue of sexuality is so wrapped up with being loved and loving. It's just completely, everybody wants to be loved, everyone wants to love. That's our natural situation. And that's the most difficult thing to do. Not having love and feeling really bad about that, and really being in that, that's a hard one to be in, and similar to desire.
Please.
I think that when we're talking about desire for another person's body, and sexual attention and energy, that is a very, very complex thing we're dealing with. There's, the Buddha's teaching is about desire, and as desire as the cause of suffering. So, in our life there are a lot easier ways to see how desire and aversion are operating in very, very small, subtle ways that you can get a grasp on. I think in a relationship with someone, you're dealing with such a complex thing. It's a major project.
That's why it's such great Dharma practice.
Yeah. But also, you got to be very, very careful, because so many things are operating. Your whole psychophysical structure is like set up to. The setup is. But it is the major project. If you can see through that, if you can operate with somebody and feel the feeling, whatever feelings you're feeling toward them, whether it's aversion or desire, and just recognize that those are emanating from your mind, and that they don't have any self-nature. They don't have any substance. They're just passing through. That's major work. That is wonderful major work.
I think part of what keeps us from growth, just to reaffirm what you're saying, a lot of what keeps us from, I think, from growth in any part of our lives is our fear of suffering. And in a way, with sexual desire, there's going to be suffering, and we're going to have it for a while. The Buddha said that he described 4 stages of enlightenment, 4 progressive stages, and he said it's only at the 3rd stage, which is very advanced stage of awakening, do desire and aversion disappear. And he said that sexual desire disappears at that stage. So for most of us, it's going to be around for a while, and we just need to learn to work with it. And so it's very powerful. This is one of the most powerful aspects of our lives. I think we need to be able to accept the fact that we're going to suffer no matter what choice we make, but that we're going to learn from our suffering, and that we need to be willing to make mistakes. Just in the area of sexuality and relationship, when I made the decision a few years ago to really investigate, I made lots of mistakes. Paul Manette, the gay writer, said you have to kiss a lot of frogs before you find a prince. So it's just to be willing to accept the fact that we are a messy experiment and we're going to suffer and we're going to make mistakes, but we learn from it and we become more and more skillful. Please.
You really made it very clear to me the dichotomy in that as gay men we mask a lot of the desire for intimacy in a sexual overture way, and certainly being very aware of that. And as David pointed out, it's an all-consuming thing. You want to get as much out of that experience as possible. But that's me. There it takes 2 to tango. What about the other partner? And more on a practical level, and I wonder if you could comment on this, is if indeed I'm more than willing to, of course, do the physical, which the other partner is obviously interested in that level too, but I'm also very free and open and desirous of the intimacy level, but the partner is not, whatever his fears are. As a Buddhist, what do you do about that? Be respectful of his place, even though you want to be respectful of your place too.
Yes, it's really, I think that's a really important question. I'm just trying to find the most skillful answer here, but one of the things that when I realized this distinction between the emotional need and the physical need, I realized what I really need in my life and want in my life is intimacy, is a sense of emotional connection. I said that to myself, and I also made a commitment to myself that I would not run away from intimacy. And I think that we men are so conditioned to fear a certain degree of intimacy. We have such conditioning as males in this society. And so that's a constant issue for us as gay men, since we're men together in our sexual relationships, is that this painful dance of intimacy, that very often one partner wants more intimacy than the other. For just in terms of finding solutions for myself, is that I made that commitment, okay, I want intimacy in my life and I won't run from it. And then one of the big mistakes that I made was to really to become deeply involved with someone who was terrified of intimacy. And it was awfully painful. Very painful. And finally I realized, okay, I have to let go, he's not going to change. But then, at that point, having gone through that very great pain of becoming deeply connected to someone who couldn't stay connected, I made a commitment to myself is that I will not consider serious relationship with anyone who's afraid of being intimate. So it just I'm not going to go through that one again. This sort of sense.
What did you do to possibly help the other partner confront the issue of intimacy and to break through so that he could be in your space? What did you?
Well, it was interesting that he didn't have a lot of self-understanding, and as a result of our relationship, he came to understand a lot more. You know, he came to realize that. I mean, he had approached me for the relationship, so he wanted intimacy. As soon as he had it, he ran. And 2 years after we split up, he was in therapy and discovered that he had been sexually abused as a child. And so he learned why he got very frightened in a sexual situation and why he had to run. And it was, you know, and he really learned from that, and we're actually still very good friends. You know, that we've maintained a good friendship, although we haven't been sexual for several years now. But it really, I think the issue that you're raising is a very, very important one. You know, that we have this constant dance of usually there's someone pursuing and someone running away in a relationship, and to find some kind of way to hold that is very important.
I just want to share something personal about that, because it brings up for me just recognizing the fear that I have of men in some profound way. I mean, certainly my father and brother taught me to fear men in the way that they were in the space that I grew up in. And I think that for me it's, you know, with women I have intimacy a lot more easily than I do with men. And I think that developing friendship and being able to feel safe is so important.
Yes.
I know coming out when I was 16 here in San Francisco and feeling like, I don't know, it was, that meeting people was through sex. That's how I met people. It wasn't like I could be out exactly, you know what I mean? At least not in high school. And I didn't feel that that was safe at all. And so it was sort of this reverse courtship process where you have sex and you see if you can be friends. And I think now in my life at this stage it's more like, well, let's see if we can be, you know, let's see if there's friendship here, and if there's a place of trust and safety, and then, you know, if there's the sexual moment to allow that to unfold also. So it's almost like a whole relearning process.
Yes, yes. It's beautiful. Thanks. Please.
I really want to thank you for your comments. They've helped me put a lot of things in perspective also. For me, 1989 was a turning point also because a relationship that I've been in since 1980 ended, and I was on my own. And this 6 years has been very much a period of discovery, and I have been very, very sexual. And I've come to a lot of the same conclusions you have about the separation. And for me, there's another really strong separation is a racial separation. That of being sexual with men of different races, there's a feeling of unity and oneness in a way. The idea of breaking down egos, of breaking down difference, it's been very powerful, to a certain extent consuming for me. And just this week on Thursday night, I found myself acting out in a way that was very inappropriate. And so I'm working with that a lot in terms of pain and suffering my own, and but there's a lot of lessons to learn from it also.
That's an insight that I've never thought of. Thank you for sharing it. That there's such a gulf between the races in our society, and that there may be a way where people can really connect even very briefly. That's very interesting. Thanks. Please.
You said that the third thing that the Buddha said about sex was, I believe, something along the lines of be careful in engaging it if it harms a third person. Could you elaborate on that a bit?
Sure.
The usual thing is to say, you know, well, that's an X or something, you know, this is.
That it's really, the old language, which is heterosexual language, is to avoid adultery, and again, that's one of the prescriptions in the Judeo-Christian world. It's not a moral category. It's just simply to avoid that which leads to suffering for others. And so, if one of two people who are, or both, who are coming together sexually, if they have some kind of bond or commitment to another person, then I think all of us have been involved in that kind of triangulation, and it's really hurts. It hurts a lot. So it's just that simple, I think.
But it's, I think, fairly complicated in gay circles too, because there could be things like my own situation. My present partner was and is in another relationship. And this third party was not really happy, and felt that bonds had been violated. So it's scary.
Yeah, it is. It really is, and it requires real delicacy, and we do the best we can. But I think it's at least useful to be aware of it. And I think one of the things that has happened to us because of these moral categories that we've been given by this Western culture, don't do this, because it's evil. There's a kind of rebellion that we went through, and we'll say, we'll do whatever we want, And what we're, I think, now trying to do, at least many of us, is to try to find that middle ground that's independent of the moral categories and the rebellion, but just finding what's the skillful thing. And you're right, it can be very complicated.
Well, I had doubts about it, but what I noticed was that his other relationship wasn't, he on his part was still committed to that relationship. And I could see it, every day in every way.
Please.
Just one comment on something earlier. I think the message we get in this culture, specifically in this culture, is that when you're talking about the separation, or these two areas of, physical and the emotional intimacy, we're taught that the only door to emotional intimacies is through the physical, and they are separate. It's not, one is an adjunct, a possible adjunct to the other, but they're not, that's not the only way in. And I've found, I've said before that I've been celibate for a number of years now, and I find that my relationships to my parents, to my siblings, friends, just people, I'm much more intimate with them, and just I've kind of discovered that that's not the way I need to, that it's not necessary to go that route to find intimacy.
That's a very good point. Yeah. Just one last...
add something to that, because we have a Buddhist Foundation study group meeting over 7 sessions, and we just did our 4th session. There's some people here in that group. And when Dave and I first planned this, we picked 7 weeks, and I thought, gee, that's going to be difficult, because it's going to be difficult for the people who sign up, and it's going to be difficult for me, every Thursday for 7 weeks. And the feeling of, it's not sexual intimacy. I don't know if anybody in the group has had sexual things outside, but it certainly is a intimate experience to engage in studying the Dharma and listening to each other and focusing in a really clear, intense, listening way. It's a very intimate experience.
Yeah, and I think there's so much purity and power in the Dharma that this is a particular kind of intimacy that comes in that particular context. Yeah.
And just one other point, I saw the bridges of Madison County yesterday, and I know it's been criticized, but it really pinpoints the dilemma of the suffering between your heart and she's in love, totally in love with this guy over 4 days, and yet she has a husband and children and commitments. And she says something in there that you are not just yourself, you are the sum of your decisions over a lifetime. And it was excruciatingly painful at the point in the end of the picture where she has a chance to decide. I won't say any more. But there is suffering. I mean, the movie is about that suffering. That third point with the time.
Yes.
Well worth seeing.
Should we?
I want to thank you, and I'm sure we all want to thank you for coming down, Tim, also, to be with us today. It's been really a wonderful chance to talk. I
think it's just wonderful that we can gather in this kind of way and talk about this particular subject. I know it's awfully rare. I mean, we could take it for granted, but it's really rare for this to happen. Really grateful to be.
Eunistic's tape. Is this for your purposes or is it for our purpose? I would like to see us put this in our newsletter, share it with the whole, the whole 470 people. We have the delight of being here, and we can listen to that.
Yeah, I'd be happy to share it. It just occurred to me that I give talks all the time and I hardly ever record them, so I just decided to start recording them. So happy to share it with you. Great. It's also, I think, just to mention, at least the newsletter says that there will be a discussion in the next meeting of sexuality as well as a kind of follow-up. Is that right? It's changed. Okay, forget. Erase.
Thank you for listening to the Gay Buddhist Forum. If you would like to hear several new talks per month and be notified of upcoming speakers so you can participate live, please subscribe to this podcast, like us on Facebook, and join our mailing list by visiting gaybuddhist.org.